Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's discussion of protests, racism, and civil-military relations, co-sponsored by the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, the International Security Policy Concentration, CIPA, the CIPA Cyber Program and Technology and Policy Initiative, the Columbia CIPA Veterans Association, CIPA Students of Color, Progressive Security Working Group, and the Digital and Cyber Group at Columbia University. I'm Stephen Biddle. I'm a member of the faculty at CIPA, a member of the Saltzman Institute, and co-director of the International Security Policy Concentration. We certainly have a timely topic this afternoon. Civil-military relations has been in the news a lot lately. We've had the conflict between the civilian Secretary of the Navy and the commanding officer of the USS Theodore Roosevelt. We've had the firing of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman from his NSC position in retaliation for his testimony for the House impeachment proceedings. We've had the revolt of the generals, in which a series of retired general officers have spoken out against Trump administration policies, and much more. But the most recent issues in this area have involved a unique confluence of civil-military relations and race. The domestic use and potential use of US military personnel to suppress protests following the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And this in turn has cast a spotlight on two now interrelated issues: the involvement of the military in partisan politics and the issue of race in the US military. Historically, there's been a strong norm in the United States against military involvement in domestic political politics, domestic partisan politics. General George C. Marshall famously refused even to vote in American elections. And there are strict limits on the legal use of American military personnel in domestic law enforcement or domestic political rallies, much less in suppression of constitutionally protected speech, as many believe occurred in Lafayette Square last month. In fact, there are also norms, though less clear and more contested, against partisan political speech by retired officers of the kind we saw in the recent revolt of the generals. The cliche is that for general officers, even after retirement, their first name is still general, and the public isn't likely to see a clear distinction between active and retired officers who are all referred to by their military rank. But norms are not physical laws. And many norms of American politics have recently been bent, some almost beyond recognition. What, if anything, are the limits on appropriate domestic uses of the military, and what should they be? And the particular stimulus for the Lafayette Park incident, the demonstrations following the death of George Floyd, raised the other issue before us this afternoon, the question of race in the United States military. 30 years ago, the American military was widely viewed as a success story in American race relations, an institution where merit rather than the color of one's skin determined how far one could get, and where even the most senior ranks were open to all regardless of their race. In the 1991 Gulf War, Colin Powell, an African-American male, served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, highest ranking officer in the US military. Yet even then, there was some reason to doubt that the reality was quite as rosy as the perception. And by many measures, conditions have decayed, not improved, since the 1990s, and especially in recent years. The number of American four-star generals and admirals today is just 1/3 of what it was as recently as 2014. The percentage of respondents to Military Times polls who've seen examples of racism or white nationalism in the military grew from 23.1% in 2017 to more than 36% by 2019. The Defense Department has prosecuted 21 criminal cases of white supremacist activity in the ranks in the last 5 years. While some military specialties continue to be seen as vehicles of opportunity for people of color in the military, others, and especially the combat arms and the special forces subset of the combat arms, have developed reputations in some corners as white-dominated organizations where the incidence of racial discrimination is now unacceptably high. So how serious a problem is this? And what can we do about it? Well, we're fortunate to have with us an outstanding panel today to help us think our way through these challenging and important issues. Our moderator, Daniel E. White, is a member of the inaugural cohort of the McCain Strategic Defense Fellows Program of the Department of Defense. His current rotation is in the Office of the Deputy Undersecretary of the Air Force for International Affairs. Daniel began his career as a field artillery officer in the US Army for over 5 years, with service in East Asia, the Middle East, and on the 52nd Field Artillery Commandant's staff. After leaving the Army as a captain, Daniel held policy and strategy roles at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and Lockheed Martin. Most recently, he was a political military affairs analyst at US Southern Command in Miami, Florida. Daniel earned his bachelor's degree and his Army commission from the United States Military Academy at West Point. Additionally, I must say and emphasize, he holds an MPA from the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University, where he was an editor at the Journal for International Affairs and rapporteur of the Columbia University Seminar on Defense and Security. His writings appeared in World Politics Review, the Modern War Institute, the Journal of International Affairs, and elsewhere. Our first panelist is Dr. Alice Hunt Friend, who's a senior fellow in the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she focuses on African security issues and U.S. civil-military relations. From 2012 to 2014, she was the Principal Director for African Affairs in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, where she focused primarily on North and West African counterterrorism policy. Dr. Friend joined the Department of Defense in 2009 as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and also served as the Senior Advisor to the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Forces, and as Country Director for Pakistan. She has held previous research positions at CSIS, in the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C., and has worked at the International Labor Organization in Geneva and with the Senegalese Association for Research, Study, and Aid to Development. Dr. Friend completed her PhD at American University's School of International Service, where she focused on the civil-military relations of special operations, unmanned systems, and cyber warfare. She is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and also holds a master's degree in international relations from American University and a bachelor's degree in government from Smith College. Our second panelist, Dr. Morton Ender, is an American sociologist and professor in the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He received an associate's degree in general education from the University of Maryland European Division in Germany, a bachelor's in sociology with distinction, and a post-undergraduate certification in the administration of nonprofit organizations, both from Sonoma State University in California, and he completed his MA and PhD both in sociology from the University of Maryland. He's an award-winning teacher at West Point and the University of Maryland. He specializes in the study and teaching of military sociology, social psychology, and teaching sociology. He is the author or co-author of 9 books, including the latest, titled Teaching and Learning the West Point Way, forthcoming this winter, to be followed by a book on U.S. Army spouses, deployments, and the global war on terror late next year. Our final panelist, Lieutenant General Vincent Stewart, is the founder and CEO of Stewart Global Solutions, LLC, an international consulting organization. He retired from the United States Marine Corps after more than 38 years of commissioned service to the nation. On his final tour of duty, he served as the Principal Deputy Commander of United States Cyber Command, one of 11 combatant commands of the Department of Defense with military and civilian personnel stationed worldwide. Prior to that assignment, he served as the 20th Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. In his other general officer assignments, he served as the Commander, Marine Corps Forces Cyberspace Command, and as the Director of Intelligence for the U.S. Marine Corps. General Stewart is also a member of a variety of professional associations, public and private boards, and serves on government pro bono committees and panels to examine ways to enhance homeland and national security capabilities. He earned a baccalaureate degree from Western Illinois University and has earned master's degrees in national security and strategic studies from the Naval War College and in national resource strategy from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces at National Defense University. Among his awards and decorations are the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Navy and Marine Corps Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, and the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. And with that, I turn the proceedings over to our moderator, Daniel White.
Thanks, Professor Biddle. Appreciate it. The first thing I would just like to say is that the views expressed here are those of the speakers alone and do not reflect the official position or policy of the United States Army, Air Force, the United States Military Academy, Department of Defense, or of the U.S. government. Okay. So with that, to jump right in, to go around the panel, I think we should start with what's obvious. And that's when you saw the riots and uprisings and protests in response to the extrajudicial killing of George Floyd and of Breonna Taylor and the Black Lives Matter movement. And then you saw, and we all witnessed, National Guardsmen and police forces and law enforcement officers who were dressed as, in some cases, the military. What was your reaction, and what impact do you think this will have, or has it had, on civ-mil relations? Dr. Friend?
Dan, thanks, and thanks for pulling this together. Dan was too modest to note, but this all started because he and I wrote a piece together that he inspired that looked at what the implications for civil-military relations were of both the killing of George Floyd, but of course then the way that the government responded in fact using National Guard forces, and when the president publicly considered using, and in fact called the 82nd Airborne quite proximate to Washington, D.C. And the answer to your question, Dan, as I was watching all of this unfold in the last week of May and the early weeks of June, was, as a civil-military relations scholar, extreme concern, because I have been thinking about and studying the politicization of the United States military for some time. In particular, I've been looking at the numbers behind the high levels of trust that most Americans express in the United States military, and how that trust and confidence often is translated into a great deal of political credibility. So we've seen trends in increasing civilian policymaker and public deference to the military over time. But we've also seen, when you dig into the numbers, a real partisan split in that trust and confidence. So while the average American tends to be in the 70s or 80% say that they have a great deal or quite a lot of trust in the military, when you look at the breakdown by party, there is often an average of a 20% or 20-point gap in that confidence, which is to say that even trust in the military, the most trusted institution we have in government, even that is the victim of political polarization. And so knowing this, and knowing that, for example, members of the Republican Party are the ones that express higher confidence, and also survey work that has shown that members of the Republican Party often see the military as their co-partisans, I became extremely concerned about the ways in which the president in particular was talking about the use of military forces in the context of these protests, because he was talking about them as more of a political tool than he was talking about appropriate law enforcement activities. And we can get into later, if you want to, the difference between those political perceptions and political uses of the military and what is actually legally available to the president, because they are different things. But as I watched the debates happen, and as I watched the military become embroiled in a very tense moment in domestic politics in the United States, I got very, very concerned that the military would be seen as actually taking a partisan side. And because we are already trending in that, the perspectives of American citizens, I worried that this would be more evidence to Americans who are watching these events that in fact the military can be used as a partisan tool, let alone whether or not they are co-partisans with one side of the country or the other. And the basic reason why this is a problem is because the military is professionally and legally a nonpartisan institution, so that any president elected will have the trust and confidence that the military will follow his or her orders, and so that every American feels that the United States military takes action in their collective interests and does not have institutional interests in any particular faction in domestic politics. And I think I'll stop there and turn to my other panelists.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Dr. Friend. Dr. Ender, what was your response?
Well, first, Dan, thanks again for asking me to be on the panel. And it's great to see my former students staying in this business. I think that's terrific. I think we're in good hands with the next generation. Also, thank you for the disclaimer. That's important. You know, as with most things like this, I was initially shocked and horrified, personally, seeing this, seeing Mr. Floyd killed. And then, you know, as things begin to progress a little bit, you know, and go outward some, I can begin to contextualize it a little bit and say, you know, essentially, here we go again. This isn't new to me. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. I was actually, even though I'm white, I was actually fed breakfast by Black Panther members, so I like those guys. But later, even in, you know, in the 1990s in South Central, after the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of those police officers, and the riots, and those were clearly riots in South Central, we did deploy active duty forces, the 7th Light Infantry from the now defunct Fort Ord. And, you know, they went down there and basically couldn't even communicate in Los Angeles because of the high-rise buildings, and they had to use cell phones to communicate. So, and then of course, you know, we saw more of this, you know, in Baltimore and in Ferguson. But this has been particularly profound in terms of the reactions. Now, in terms of and the ongoing reactions. Then in terms of sort of the military side, I'm a sociologist, so I don't look at this necessarily politically. For me, as a military sociologist, I'm interested in the constituents. How do different groups look at this? So part of me is a little bit concerned about the soldiers who have to go there. How do they feel about it? You know, you see these stoic guys, well, in some, they're not particularly stoic in Portland, but you know, they're often stoic, just staring at the protesters. You know, what are they thinking? How do they feel about being in this particular role? Also concerned about, you know, 16 and 17-year-old American kids who are looking at that, thinking about maybe going into the military and thinking about, you know, I don't know if I want to be a part of an organization that does that kind of work. We could also frame this in terms of Morris Janowitz's ideas about what the role of the military is in American society. It's pretty interesting to me that the president, on the one hand, seems to want to pull troops out of war zones on one hand. On the other hand, he's really kind of Janowitzian in the way he wants to expand the role of what military members do, to include going down to the border last year, the last couple of years, and doing other kind, and certainly, you know, deploying into Portland. So, you know, the American public needs to sort of think through, you know, what do they want their military to do? What is the role of the military in the United States? Is it a broad-based, open definition where there are a number of different roles that it performs, or is it more Huntingtonian where, you know, we exclusively just fight and win the nation's wars? So that's kind of my approach, a little bit more sociological. I'll kind of leave it there. I could talk more about, you know, the intersection of race into this process and how might not only just soldiers in general, but how might African-American soldiers feel, or future soldiers feel about, you know, doing these kinds of duties and those kinds of things. But I'll just leave it there for now.
Thanks, Dr. Ender. I appreciate that, especially to understand the Janowitzian side of it when a conversation, at least academically, and even most often in practice, revolves just around Huntington. So, Lieutenant General Stewart.
So before we got to the protest, the images that are burned into my head and will stay there for the rest of my days are two images. Image number one, Officer Coven, knee on the neck of George Floyd. The look on his face early in the episode a look of anger and domination and hatred. On the bottom of on the ground, the eyes of George Floyd, fear, dread, pleading for his life. 8 minutes and 40 some seconds later, the images are very different. The image of George Officer Cohen, again, very nonchalantly with his knee on the neck, very calm, waiting for something as we have watched the murder of George Floyd. And on the bottom, George Floyd's lifeless body. Nothing, his eyes are closed. I don't know what his condition is at the time, but those two images on the front end and the back end of that murder caused me at that moment to say, I could no longer be silent. And we talked about the concern of retired military and active duty military to not get involved in what could be political events. This was not a political event for me. This harkened back to what Dr. King would say, our life, quote, our life begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. This mattered. This was an event that we've seen over and over again, where there is a different approach to dealing with men and women of color. This murder, I could not sit back and not speak out. And I was not concerned to be well, that's not entirely true. I was concerned about what it would reflect to our society that a retired 3-star would speak out. But this social injustice, this moment, I couldn't walk away from. You'll find very few things that I've written that's out there. You find that I generally keep a low profile. But we've seen this happen too many times where lives are taken. Think about this. Had that video not been made and publicized, we would not be talking about George Floyd. George Floyd would have died in custody. Someone would probably say, yeah, but he had drugs in his system. And oh, by the way, he was passing counter, and he really wasn't very important. And so it's just another death in custody. But it was recorded, and those of us who saw that, if you weren't touched by it, I'm sorry, but I question your humanity. You watched the murder live, and so I had to speak out. I will tell you also that folks have said it was courageous, the thing that I wrote. I don't know if folks have read the op-ed, Take Your Knee Off Our Neck So We Can Breathe. And what I tried to do in that op-ed is just have those who the color of my skin is not transferable. And I wanted those who didn't have the challenge of having, being a person of color, just walk a couple episodes in my shoe. And you quickly realize that this is a moment that we can truly do two things. Live up to the words in our Declaration of Independence, the words that are in our Constitution. We can live up to those things, or we can continue on the path that just be patient. It will all work itself out organically over time. And then the second thing was, as we watched this event become a partisan event, why is it that in this moment of crisis, we could not come together as a nation to solve this issue? And so the, quote, revolt of the generals speaks to the credibility that we have, the confidence that the American people have in us, the fact that for the most part, we try to be apolitical. We generally don't jump into the fray, but this administration has dragged us into a polarized environment. Our military leaders are used as props to strengthen an argument. And I've cautioned all of them to be careful about how they're utilized that way. but they have limited options. They have limited options to either be courageous and say, I will not participate and I'll resign. That option keeps them from then influencing the action inside, and you end up with just the sycophants at the top advising the administration. But the administration has used our military as props, and I know that they are all uncomfortable as heck with that. We all have made the commitment to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not to support and defend a party or a particular leader. He's the commander-in-chief, I get that. But it ought to be remain where we have the trust of the American people. And I think the use of our military, both as props for policy or against peaceful protest in the streets, is reprehensible and is dangerous to our democracy. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, General Stewart. I think, onto your point, there is, some literature out there that talks about what is principled resignation and kind of what options do senior military leaders have in times that they feel maybe an order is illegal, immoral, or unethical, or in some cases that there's just a situation that they feel they are no longer fit to serve. I want to now kind of dive into the relationship between the African American and Black community with the military. And a lot of it goes to the relationship with the community and the military from the Vietnam War. And there was this idea that Black folks were being drafted at a higher rate and were being sent to the front lines at a higher rate. And it created a schism between the two. And then you see kind of remnants of that today, where there is not a lot of Black officers who are choosing, and NCOs and enlisted folks who are choosing to enter the combat arms. The combat arms, be it infantry and artillery and armor, is the pipeline to the senior military leaders. So then the question becomes, how is there a way that the military can mold and make that relationship better? Because what is at risk is a senior cadre of folks who are all white leading an American people that is becoming increasingly more diverse. So is diversity, in essence, at the top, a threat? And we'll go in reverse order and start with General Stewart.
So this is one of those interesting chicken or the egg, which comes first kind of question, because in many cases, we know that the top leaders come from the combat arms communities. We know that. But many of the folks, African Americans who enter, seeing no opportunities or limited opportunities at the top, see opportunities in the middle to transition to a private sector job. I'm going to go into the military. I'm going to get that terrible phrase because I'm bad at English. I'm going to get that on my resume. I served in the military, but ultimately I really want to get to the private sector and be part of that community. So they're not jumping into combat arms because combat arms doesn't translate into the private sector very well. So they're going into logistics, they're going into intelligence, they're going into things that will someday help their resume to get a private sector job. So the issue now is twofold. One, well, let me do it this way. A lot of times we think about diversity in recruiting African Americans. We need to expand the base. So we need to figure out how we double the number of folks who are coming in at the entry level. That hasn't worked very well, and one of the reasons it hasn't worked very well is because we have not targeted retention. So we're not keeping and we're not making the folks who are in the middle feel comfortable that they have a future and doing the targeted retention of that force. And that's the same in the private sector, I'll tell you. I just spoke to a Marine captain who's leaving the Marine Corps, and shockingly, he said, I was the first person who asked him, what would it take for you to stay in the Marine Corps? Here's a incredibly bright, incredibly capable captain, someone who has the potential to reach the top of the pyramid. He's in the intelligence community, but we made no attempt to keep him around. So one start point, yes, combat arms drive the senior leadership. Those are the guys who are going to be combatant commanders. They're the ones who are going to be the operations officer. They're the ones who are going to lead their organizations at the top of the pyramid. But we're not putting enough people in those assignments, and we're not retaining our very best in those assignments. And our very best are not looking necessarily at that because they don't see an opportunity at the top, but they do see an opportunity when they retire and transition to the private sector. So a lot of targeted effort in order to change those dynamics.
Thank you, General Stewart. I think it is important to understand the breadth of the problem, and really, is it, you know, a matter of the pull to bring more folks in? Is it a matter of force branching, or is it a matter of, like you said, the retention? There's a variety of ways to look at the problem. Dr. Ender?
Yeah, well, what the general said, and let me sort of add a little bit more to the plate. So yeah, Dan, you're absolutely right. African Americans have a long treasured history of service to the United States. You know, going all the way back to the American Revolution. I just finished reading Washington's Crossing, and just a compelling work on the role that African Americans, you know, played then, and then certainly all through our history. And certainly the United States is the first, the United States military is the first institution to desegregate. I mean, technically baseball, Jackie Robinson started, you know, baseball was integrated in 1947, but that was just one guy. You know, the Kansas City Monarchs didn't join Major League Baseball. Unlike the military in 48, what you see is a desegregated military now. Relatively segregated. It really didn't happen until, interestingly, didn't really begin to fully desegregate until the Korean War. Indeed, that particular war, because it too was somewhat ambiguous to Americans, and local draft boards, and certainly combat arms was the most prestigious branch to serve in. Local draft boards started sort of holding white boys back a little bit from going into that war. That opened up opportunities for African Americans who wanted to serve and wanted to serve in combat arms, and that drastically accelerated desegregation. And then certainly, you know, by 1973, and we can talk about this some more, you know, should we even be having an all-volunteer force? But in 1973, nobody was really talking much about race in the military, and President Nixon wanted to, he wanted to end the draft. I think it was a political decision to end the draft so he could win the college kid vote. And he put together a committee, the Gates Commission, which had mostly economists on it, who basically said, yeah, it's economically we can do this. The generals, and indeed Morris Janowitz, were on that committee, and they said, hey, you know, this might not be a good thing. We're not sure who's going to show up. And interestingly, what no one really predicted is that a lot of women showed up and a lot of people of color showed up, because basically it was a great job, and the economy wasn't doing particularly well. So it was a great opportunity. So, and then once they came, they stayed. And, you know, to get back to some of the general's ideas about, you know, if you're thinking about, you know, should I stay in the organization and should I leave? You know, if you're African American in American society, you have to be a bit more savvy about your opportunities, because your opportunities are limited because of racism. So you've got to go, well, do I throw all my eggs into this basket and go combat arms and try to make it up? Or do I kind of keep one foot in the private sector through combat service support, get some kind of skill, and maybe if this doesn't work out, if I hit a glass ceiling, I can jump over to the civilian sector. Now, in the enlisted ranks, what we see is a huge swelling of African Americans, a disproportionate number relative to their numbers to the larger population, including women, stayed in. It was a great opportunity, and there's been a long legacy of that service, and their children came into the organization, and we know that, and they're still coming into the organization, which is another sort of issue of, you know, are we becoming a military where officers and enlisted people make our soldiers for the future. So there's that has certainly gone on. And right now, I think the numbers are that the officer ranks are in proportion to the larger society. The numbers have been dwindling in the enlisted ranks, but that has a lot to do with the economy, and the economy has been doing well for you know, a number of years. So, and of course, you know, more kids can get into college, although college is pretty expensive. I think those numbers will increase now because the economy is doing really rough. If I'm a college student today, if I'm 18 or 19 and I was thinking about going to college, I might not go now. I know professors' heads are exploding. I mean, college presidents' heads are exploding out there, but I would see them maybe taking a gap year or maybe even saying, I'm going to go into the military. The officer ranks, again, that certainly is a different animal, as the general pointed out. I mean, the track to generalship seems to be through combat arms. Maybe we need within the organization to sort of rethink that track of getting people to those senior positions. I've got some ideas if you know, we want to talk later about some ways of improving that.
Thanks, Dr. Ender. Appreciate your insight, kind of the totality of it all. Dr. Friend?
Yeah, both Dr. Ender and General Stewart alluded to this, but I'm just going to say it really starkly for anyone in the audience who doesn't realize it, that the enlisted ranks are not only representative of America, but in many measures over-representative of America. So I know that the number of Black Americans in the enlisted ranks is greater than the percentage of the overall American population that is Black, for example. In 2017, 43% of the enlisted ranks was a racial or ethnic minority. So, and by the way, the representativeness goes on, male, female, ideological, partisanship, et cetera. So the enlisted ranks are actually doing very well at representing America. The officer corps, though it varies among the services, in general, is very white, very male, and very Southern as well. And the Center for New American Security has a report out that's a few years old at this point, but that really digs into these numbers and looks at the trends over time of why the officer corps in particular has become more and more demographically and geographically insular. But this is, of course, as Dan points out in his excellent piece at the Modern War Institute, which tackles this bit about Black Americans and Black soldiers going into the combat arms. Tackles that there are real consequences to this insularity. And the major reason for that is mentorship. Again, this is Dan's piece, but this is absolutely true, and it's true across the national security enterprise. When you have people who are either like you or unlike you, take an interest in your career, as General Stewart said, if someone wants to retain you, you will be retained. So that there are not more Black officers means that there will not be more Black officers. And also that white officers aren't taking as seriously the retention of Black officers and of Black enlisted really matters, right? So people like me need to decide that it is important to seek out and help and promote and advance the careers of people who come from minority groups, or else it's not going to happen. Same thing with women in national security. My three most important mentors in my career, who quite literally advanced me and promoted me, gave me more and more senior roles, were all women. And if they hadn't broken through and been there to promote me, I am not sure I would still be promoted today. My dissertation committee, all women, right? And it is not that there are not men out there that promote women, it's just that not enough of them promote women. It is not that there are not white people in our country that don't promote Black and brown Americans, but there aren't enough. And one of the things that I have found heartening about the response to George Floyd's murder is the number of white Americans in surveys who say, I take this more seriously now, and I take this personally now, and I think it's something I have to do something about, went up dramatically. And that's what we're going to need. We're going to need it in the military. We're going to need it in the United States, in American society as well.
Thanks, Dr. Friend. I appreciate that. And I think, kind of on that, that we've been talking a lot about the military, and a lot of the literature that is out there, like sociologist Charles Moscow's, it talks about Black participation, but there is a lack of literature that looks at race when it concerns civ-mil relations, in political science and in some parts in sociology. But I think another part is to understand that the national security enterprise, or in DC as we call it, the blob, is more than just military members. And there are a lot of civilians who are serving, whether it's the Pentagon or whether it's overseas, in a variety of capacities. So all three of you all have been in this national security space in one way or another. So do you think, where are we at in terms of diversity and connectedness in civilian side of the national security space, and where do you see the future of that? General Stewart, we'll start with you.
So again, it goes back to the issue that a lot of people believe that this will happen organically. And I hate, just take a look at what the National Football League has done. They've mandated that if you're going to be hired as a head coach, you ought to at least have one person, African-American, interviewed in the process. The National Football League, everybody recognizes that if you're going to be a head coach, you probably ought to have been a coordinator somewhere along the way, because that puts you in a position to go from coordinating one element to managing and coordinating the team. But and this is the challenge, because everybody's terrified of the idea that somehow we're going to create a quota, we're going to create an unfair system. It just has not happened organically. So I ask folks now to take a look at their front office. Who are they selecting to be their executive assistant, their chief of staff? Are those jobs, do they look like you, or they look at your front office? If your front office is one demographic, you shouldn't be surprised that they're the future leaders of the organization. They're seeing senior level decision making. They're getting their evaluation written by seniors. They're getting it reviewed by seniors. They're around other seniors who will sit their board. Holy cow, surprise, surprise, they got selected for the next rank and the next grade position. So if we're not very deliberate about this, and we just go, no, we have got to get out there and targeted recruiting, putting it. Now, I may not have gotten this right, but I identified, when I was the director of intelligence, the 4 key billets I wanted my top colonels to fill. And then we looked across the enterprise and we picked the very best. And interestingly enough, we had a nice demographic. There was not just a bunch of African Americans, because I was. In fact, there were only 1 or 2 in many cases. But we had a diverse group who filled those key billets. They get to see senior level decision making. They got to see how the enterprise ran. They got to get their evaluation done by the future leaders of the organization. And guess what? We now have 4 active duty intelligence officers at the general officer rank in the Marine Corps, and 2 are African American and 1 is Vietnamese, first generation Vietnamese. So it can be done, but it must be purposeful. It will not happen organically, and we have to get away from feeling uncomfortable that we're doing things to create opportunities. We need folks who will reach down into the hole that we're in and pull us up and mentor and guide and sponsor. Otherwise, it will not happen organically. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate it. Dr. Fring, you were a civilian in the Pentagon, and you were working on these issues, particularly African security. So what were your observations of what was, how that relationship and diversity looked like?
So, national security on the civilian side is in many ways not doing as well as the military is on diversity issues. Those numbers that I just cited on the enlisted ranks, we don't see that at the top certainly in the Office of the Secretary of Defense when I served there. You know, in think tanks around town, there is some diversity, but there's certainly not enough. Another outcome of the Black Lives Matter protests that we've been seeing for the last couple of months has been a real reckoning in the national security community, at least outside government. I'm not in the Pentagon anymore, so I can't speak to that. But certainly folks in my own think tank, folks in think tanks across town, again, have been thinking much more deliberately about this in the past. How do we get more diverse representation, diversity, equity, and inclusion on panels, on the people who work for us, on the people who write for us? And taking seriously, that's something we have to do deliberately. I really like how General Stewart put it. It's not happening organically. And it's not happening organically because our networks are other people kind of like us, right? Like I know a lot of white women in national security. I just do. And so if I want to promote and bring in diverse voices, I have to go outside my comfort zone, outside my network, and find them and make it happen. And again, I'm really heartened. I know my own institution, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, has been taking this very seriously, and had already been thinking about how do we get more diverse voices in both the pipeline of folks that we welcome to the center and include in our conversations, but also the folks that we hire. And that effort has been re-energized. That's happening across town. What we need to do is not lose momentum on that, not get overwhelmed or distracted by the other things that are going on in the national security space, and there's a lot. You know, there's also a ton of resources out there now, so that if you are looking, if you want to partner with organizations like Diversity and National Security, women also know stuff, people of color also know stuff out in national security. There are lots and lots of places now that are proactively trying to diversify the national security enterprise and professional space so that it too represents all of America. I will say when I was in OSD, you know, I served in the Obama administration, and the Obama administration took diversity and took making the administration look like and represent America very seriously. But even so, in the national security space, we struggled with who's already in the network, who already knows people. If you've worked in DC, you know that it's all about networking. And when you're trying to hire someone else, the first thing you do is call everybody you know and ask who their really awesome research assistants are, what great interns have you had recently. But if the pipeline is all from a certain demographic, that's who's in the mix, that's who's in the network, and that's who gets recycled into the system. So right now we're having a reckoning where we're figuring out how do we open way more on-ramps or way more spigots into that system so that we cycle everybody through, not just a narrow demographic.
You know, that's a really good point. And I think the way that we can do that, I think particularly for think tanks, is actually very easy. Actually pay your interns. I think one of the things that happens is you have folks who want to intern at these great think tanks that are doing phenomenal work, and it's only open to folks who can afford to move to DC for the summer because it's unpaid, or if it is paid, it might be a transportation stipend or just a little money here or there. So it is frustrating to see these think tanks that talk about diversity but don't make it, you know, that buzzword now, equitable, for everyone to apply to and everybody actually to do that. Dr. Ender.
Hey, Dan, before you move on, if I could just build on Dr. Friend's comments. It is remarkable how many phone calls I get since George Floyd requesting me to be on a board or an advisory group. And you look at the group that they're inviting me and you go, now I get it. It's not because I'm tall and good looking, it's because of the color of my skin. Because you look at the boards and these advisory groups and they're all white and they may have one or two female, they check the diversity block. And so I say that because I wrestle with the idea now that I'm just gonna fill that slot. And I wrestle with the idea that I'm tired of being the first to do X. And the other piece is, where is that network when they're looking for that individual that's competent, capable, fully qualified, who also happens to be African American? And I know Senator Romney got in trouble when he was asked a few years back about getting women into his cabinet, and he said, "I have a book." I'm not finding that I've got to have a book of here are my top 20 African Americans. So when someone asks for recommendations and I give them 3, I know I've got a competent, capable, qualified African American that's in the mix. So people are trying, but it feels really awkward that we're trying as opposed to, we're further along in this process. And this applies not just in the military, it certainly fully applies in the national security space. There's not enough people in the pipeline. We're not identifying the best, and we're probably not putting them in a position to lead their organizations and be at least an example for folks in the future. Sorry for jumping ahead of Dr. Ender, but I just wanted to build a little on that.
No, General, so I think it's important. I think tokenism is something to understand and realize what it is. And I think also, we are a nation of immigrants, and our diversity can be our strength, particularly whether it's diplomacy or national security, when you can have a foreign service officer who, has parents in the country or grandparents in the country and has a cultural nuance that they might understand, but are American at the end of the day and can further positive American leadership. Dr. Ender, this talk about diversity, I know recently the Department of Behavioral and Sciences, along with the English department and the history department, brought together a diversity minor at West Point. So I'd like to ask you, what did that take, and why do you see, particularly at a place that commissions Army officers and at the other service academies, what is the purpose of that diversity minor, and will it help kind of bridge that gap as far as minority communities and the military?
Yeah, well, thanks for that softball question. I mean, but before I, kind of brag about our diversity and inclusion studies minor, let me just say that, someone, I'll throw this out to any grad students out there, someone needs to write the military case for diversity. The business case for diversity has been pretty much written. Essentially that, the bottom line is affected by you not being diverse. If you don't appeal to certain segments of the population, like, for example, the growing segment of the population, Hispanics in particular, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and various groups, you're not going to be successful. So that case has pretty much been made. I think it's easy to make the case for diversity in the military on 2 levels. One is, we especially going back to this idea of Janowitz, if you're going to deploy militaries in a whole host of different contexts, in a whole host of different operations other than war, to include war, you're going to have to also win hearts and minds. So you've got to be culturally savvy to do that. My buddy here at West Point, Remy Hajar, has written about cross-cultural competence is a skill that officers need. But not only do you need that abroad, you need that at home as well. You need to know, as a new platoon leader, who are these people that you're standing in front of? Who are these people in your platoon? And how can you mobilize them and lead them to be the best that they can be? So I think that, that argument needs to be written, and then the military, generally the branches specifically, can begin to operationalize what they mean by diversity and inclusion, and not just use, the current buzzwords. We took advantage of being at an academic institution where we have, academic freedom to deal with the concerns of our cadets and the concerns of our faculty. So we stood up a diversity and inclusion committee in 2003. And over time, that committee has done a whole host of things on behalf of the Academy to include the establishment of this minor. And this minor came out of the idea basically from cadets. we've been recruiting record numbers of African American cadets, Hispanic cadets, Native American cadets, Asian cadets. Far more women are at West Point at the academies that have ever been there. And as I told my colleagues, well, what are we going to do when they all show up? They're not just going to come here and not be interested in things that affect their lives. So, you know, my cadets wanted courses on this topic. They wanted to do term papers on these topics. And these topics, I mean, race, class, gender topics. So we thought, well, it's time to really institutionalize this and create a minor. Anybody that works in higher ed knows that, you know, it's difficult to get a new program in place. It takes a long time. It's even more difficult in a military institution to do that, where, you know, tradition tends to rule. But we've been really successful. We just graduated our first class in the minor, 9 cadets in the class of 2020. You know, we think a number of cadets are going to continue to come our way. We're looking down the line, ideally maybe to get a visiting professor in diversity and inclusion studies to kind of anchor the program even more, and certainly to bring more, you know, cadets who traditionally might not even want to be interested in this topic to kind of question, you know, what are you guys talking about? I'm interested in these kinds of topics. So really planting a seed on diversity and inclusion and equity with the next generation of leaders academically. And there's been a great amount of spillover for that minor into other segments of the academy. So we're excited about that. But again, I come back to this idea of we need to really begin to kind of institutionalize these things in the military for people to really get behind. I think there are plenty of white, straight, male, cisgender officers out there that are willing to reach down and mentor women, mentor people that don't look like them. They just, you know, want the skills and they want to do the right thing. And we have to be smart and teach them how to do that.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ender. And just a reminder to the audience, we're going to transition after this last question to audience questions. So continue to type those questions in the Q&A box. So when we talk about civ-mil affairs, there's this concept of, according to Huntington, objective civilian control. So the question becomes, as we talk about diversity, as we talk about, you know, how are we doing and what is this, you know, is diversity just descriptive representation or is it more broad? So the question becomes, what is the role and who should be leading this charge from the civilian side? Is it the lawmakers? I know in the newest National Defense Authorization Act, there was a position created for the Secretary of Defense to have a strategic diversity advisor, or is it civilians being the voters to say, hey, I want something different? So what can be done from the civil side of that objective control or that civilian control of the military? We'll start with Dr. Friend.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to base it off of Sam Huntington and thinking about objective control and then about diversification is sort of wild, because I think he himself would never in a million years have thought about those two things meeting. But, you know, the idea of objective control is essentially that there are spheres of expertise and competence, and that the best way to keep the military out of politics is to allow them to manage their own profession and to be left to manage the operational and tactical level of warfare to the greatest extent possible, right? It's what Elliot Cohen calls the normal theory. And then Elliot Cohen proceeds to completely dismantle and destroy that theory because that's not how politics works. And so in the spirit of trying to take apart Huntington, though we can't ever seem to escape him, and myself completely agreeing with Dr. Cohen, you know, I do think that if this is a priority for the country, it therefore has to be a priority for our politicians. So it has to be a priority for Congress, and it also has to be a priority for whoever is in the administration. So it's that the Congress and the executive branch should be working together very carefully and working with senior leadership at the Pentagon in the services and in OSD, in PNR, in policy, to make this a reality. Again, we've discussed how by some measures, the services are actually doing quite well for themselves. Certainly on the enlisted side, the inclusion is good. The experience in the enlisted ranks, and I commend to everyone watching Chief, I always screw it up in the Air Force, Chief Sergeant Master, Caleth O'Wright's Twitter thread that he did in either very late May or very beginning of June about his own experience as a Black man inside the force. And that, you know, racism is not gone. It has not been purged from the ranks because it has not been purged from America. And so as in America, so too in the ranks of the armed forces, right? So, you know, we have a long way to go. But if we want to keep pushing on this and keep taking this seriously, and in particular want to make sure that our nation's military addresses diversity issues, addresses racism, becomes anti-racist itself, truly and thoroughly and persistently, then absolutely you need civilian leadership to say, this is a priority, we're going to give you resources, we're going to support you, we're going to give you guidance, but you have to do it. And that's going to take the executive and the legislative branches to pull off.
I'm always hesitant to say we need more laws and legislative involvement in order to get us to do the right things. But in this case, you need bipartisan legislative guidance and direction mandated in order, again, to not believe that this will happen just because good people think it will happen, but they're held accountable to making a difference in this very significant time. So yeah, generally my response is not a high degree of confidence in legislating good behavior, but getting our executive and our legislative branch aligned against this challenge of diversity and inclusion is absolutely critical at this point.
And I will jump in really quickly to say, we don't even have to legislate. Just the power of the Congress to ask questions during confirmation hearings, right? They ask, you know, folks with stars on their shoulders who are going up for promotion or going up to be combatant commanders or chiefs of the services, you know, they get to ask them, how are you going to perform your job? So certainly they can do it that way as well. Their oversight function in applying that pressure and in doing exactly that accountability you talk about, that's also a great avenue for them without them having to legislate anything.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. My great fear is that we're so polarized that it'll turn out to be a loyalty test and then a vote. I've always said that the thing that would end my career was testifying on the Hill, because I'd get up and walk out because there's so much BS and theater that goes on there. That even when you're walking down the center line, one side of the aisle says you're a hero, and the other side considers you a traitor. We are just that polarized these days.
The reality that we live in. We're going to transition now to some questions from the audience. One of the first questions is by a person, and they asked, is the military's apolitical reputation irreparably damaged by the number of senior military leaders who have served in the current administration? You know, reference to the revolt of the generals, which is kind of hearkening back to the 2006 revolt of the generals with the Bush administration and the actions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And if not, is there somewhat a road of recovery that these senior leaders can have in order to move forward in a new administration? So I'm kind of boiling it down. Is there ways in which the senior leaders can maneuver in order to still come out of this with an opportunity to continue to lead?
History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. So I don't know that the reputation has been irreparably damaged. I just, especially in this environment where it has become acceptable to demonstrate hatred and bigotry and racism. I think credibility that comes from our senior retired military leaders is important now, and is worth any damage to our reputation for being impartial. Generally, I think we will remain because we're balanced most of the time, in spite of the demographics at the officer rank. We are still viewed as the most trustworthy institution. And I think we'll get past this environment. As long as we continue to speak truth to power and are willing to take those courageous actions, I think we'll be okay.
General Stewart, you just mentioned that the military is the most trusted institution, and we've seen that time again. And Dr. Ender, I know you worked on the BAS, the biannual student survey that basically looked at college students around the country, looking at, what organizations and institutions do people have faith in? So, sir, do you believe that what is happening now, if you were to redo that BAS study, would it change? And do you think with a new generation and with new things going on and with the polarization and with Black Lives Matter, that the institution of the military will either decrease or increase, or is it a bit nuanced?
Well, we still do the BAS study. It's been renamed the Gen Z study because we have a new generation to study it. So it's coming on 20 years of data comparing American civilian college students to ROTC cadets to military academy cadets. Look, I agree with the general. I think there's the data seems to suggest that there's so much esteem associated with the military that even to lose some, they would still have a great deal of it to carry forward and get through any troubled periods. Indeed, I think it's the reason why the military is perceived to be, that trust gets translated into action, right? So I think the American public, when there's a crisis, they want to see the military come in and handle it. After Katrina, General Honore is probably one of the most esteemed generals, recognizable generals in the United States, even still today. And we sent the 82nd in there after that, and the military managed that. And certainly after 9/11 as well, all the esteem of the first responders. I think the police have lost a lot of that esteem that they garnered during that period. I think firefighters still have it, and certainly the military still has it. So that becomes a little bit, again, concerning about, what is the role of the military, and what do Americans want their military to do? Should we be fighting, parts of California are burning at any given time. Should we send the Army in there to put out those fires or to deal with hurricane relief, other domestic kinds of things, or even international situations like, Puerto Rico? So, the military can easily get over that bridge of esteem that it loses. But then the other side is it has so much esteem that the American public wants them to do everything. And then that becomes a little bit scary as well, because we have other spaces and places for other groups to manage that. How much do we want to militarize America? And my colleague Don Campbell and his wife, the late Kathy Campbell, wrote a great piece on, the increased militarization of the police, but also the increased policing of the U.S. military. And those two groups sort of blurring those lines between the two. And I think we're in that space certainly right now. And, the role of uniforms, for example, again, concerns me that they are, uniforms serve a utility function and a practical function for soldiers. They are camouflage, and you don't necessarily need camouflage in those urban situations where they're in. So in that sense, they're used for symbolic purposes of intimidation. So again, sort of bridging these, blurring these lines between these two institutions. But again, I think the military will fare potentially well.
If I could, Dan, the place where we love the fact that our military, if there's a disaster in this country, that the military will bring the right planners, the right strategic thinking, the logistics, and help us to get through those sorts of natural disasters. Where we will lose credibility is when we believe, our countrymen believe, that we're complicit in the use of military force against its own people, especially its own people who are, quote, peacefully protesting. Continued use of the military in that regard will absolutely change the way the American people trust us, have confidence in us, and are supportive of us if we appear complicit in the misuse of the military. And at some point, someone is going to resign in protest because it is either immoral, unethical, illegal, or just my good conscience won't support it. But I think the American people are really comfortable with us in terms of being helpful. They're going to be uncomfortable and will lose credibility if they believe we're complicit in the misuse of the military.
Hey, Dan, can I take a stab at this too?
Please do.
So something I want to flag is that, again, there's very high confidence numbers, astronomically high confidence numbers, particularly compared to other institutions. But Corey Shockey and Jim Mattis did a survey with YouGov and then produced a book out of it in 2016 before Jim Mattis became Secretary Mattis, that also found a really high level of ignorance. So Americans have a lot of trust and confidence in an institution that they know nearly nothing about. And more recently, Ron Krebs has a piece in Foreign Affairs, and then he has a longer scholarly piece as well, where you can pick apart his data, that shows that Americans are also increasingly comfortable with jettisoning the kinds of civil military norms, like an apolitical military, that the military has rested on for so long, that the notion of military professionalism in a domestic sense has really been defined by an idea of nonpartisan service to the nation. And I noted earlier that increasingly that high confidence and that perspective on the military among Americans is conditioned by their partisan views. So partisans see the military differently. For example, partisans have more confidence in the military when their own party is in the presidency. Right? This is true for both sides of the aisle. If that is the case, then I'm not sure that the military has an apolitical reputation anymore. And that is very bad, because it means that while I hope that General Stewart is correct and that there are red lines for the American people, there are things that they absolutely do not want to see the military do, I fear that instead, that when the military is used domestically, there will be partisans that are comfortable with it and partisans that are uncomfortable with it. And that is what we're courting right now in the survey trends. So I just want to flag that for the person who asked the question.
Thanks so much. No, I think it's important to note kind of where the body it is, and that is true. So one of the next questions that we have is back to the Huntington argument, and it's really is, will objective control ever get us where we need to be? And is subjective control, particularly in a liberal democracy, as Dr. Ender kind of alluded to, the right answer to go? And if so, what would that transition look like? So Dr. Ender or Dr. Freen, would you like to start? Go ahead, Dr. Ender.
I'm guilty of, I didn't get the question. I shouldn't be reading the comments, and I'm not paying attention to your question. I'm looking at the comments and the questions. So
I'll repeat it. So
ask it again, Dan.
Yep. So I think the question becomes, if, as we alluded to, this idea that objective control, Huntington's kind of hallmark of civil relations, doesn't really address race. It doesn't address what's going on, and it doesn't address the true partisanship that has impacted the military. And we might need to transition to a model that is more of Janowitz's idea, convergence theory, or just subjective control. So what would that transition look like if we were to go from objective to subjective?
I'm not really sure. I again, when I think of Janowitz, I think of an expanded role of the military. I think of a draft in some capacity, and more so in even universal national service, which is really unpopular. Only a few of us would sort of advocate for that. But I think this idea of leadership redefining what citizenship means. You know, we currently have no real citizenship obligations other than paying taxes, which you can get out of with not working, voting, which you don't have to do, jury duty, which you can get out of without voting in most states. So there really aren't any citizenship obligations. So we need a real, I think, civic consciousness awakening in education. And I think it's already there. We require service learning in a lot of states amongst our students. Indeed, I think it's why young people are protesting. I think they have a deep desire to be patriotic and do the right thing. And in some ways, protesting is patriotic. I mean, that is, I think these young people, well, all of us see this as a duty when we see an injustice, and that becomes a form of patriotism. I think leadership, though, needs to figure out a way to tap into that spirit subjectively and wrangle it, and maybe move away from our preoccupation with individualism, and maybe move a little bit more towards some civic consciousness and some civic citizenship obligations. But that's a radical idea.
So objective control has never really been practiced in the United States. Risa Brooks wrote a brilliant piece that described how the whole notion of objective control was an artifact of the particular era in which Huntington was writing The Soldier and the State in 1957. And, you know, not only have we moved beyond that, but the whole design of the policymaking system now is collaborative. So there are mixes of civilians and military almost at every level of policymaking. Policies made at the NSC where there's joint staff presence all the time. There's constant interaction in the Pentagon. There's constant interaction between the military and the Congress. There's just way too much civil military collaboration to empirically believe that the objective control model has ever been realized or ever will be realized. That's just not how we govern, which I'm comfortable with. But you know, one of the big points of objective control was to keep the military out of politics. And this is where my great friend and mentor, Jim Golby, has brought me along, in that there's a difference between politics and partisanship. You can't help but involve the military in politics. War is politics by other means. Policymaking is involved in politics. The defense budget is fundamentally political. Politics is just a process by which we debate what we value and what's important and what we're going to prioritize. There's nothing wrong with politics. Partisanship is what you want to keep the military away from, because partisanship is about fights between different factions in the United States and the domestic environment and who gets what. And we don't want the military to be on one faction's side against another domestic faction. That's where we fall down a slippery slope. So, you know, the notion of keeping the military out of politics is not practiced, is also not practical, but the notion of keeping the military as nonpartisan as practically possible is worth reaching for, and I think is something we could still grasp out of the jaws of defeat.
So then to get more granular, I think the question becomes, and one of the questions that was typed is, we talk about, you know, the military being the difference between political versus partisanship, right? You know, how there's that distinct line. So now the question is there a way that individual service members, while they're still on active duty, or if they're cadets, or if they're guardsmen and women, can they protest, or is there a space for them to participate in these events while still being nonpartisan? Is that possible?
They can be partisan as they want in their private capacity. So they can, you know, DOD instruction 1344.10 lays this out in excruciating detail, but helpful detail. The issue is that any soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine should not say, as a soldier and as a representative of the US Army, I think X candidate should win this election, right? I think this party should be in control of the Congress. That is not allowed. That is unhealthy. And because so much of partisanship is about perceptions and perspectives, that's really hard to pull off in practice, because there's all kinds of perceptions out there of the Army, for example, or of the Navy, you know, having some partisan purpose that the Navy and the Army can't always control. But where I always come down on this, and when I'm advising folks in uniform, is you can explicitly say, when you are in front of an audience or where you're in front of friends or family members, as a soldier, as a sailor, as an airman, as a Marine, I cannot be partisan. As your brother, as your sister, as your daughter, whatever, you know, private citizen, these are my views. But these are not the view, you know, just the caveat you had us all put up front. These are not the views of the Department of Defense or the Department of the Army. You know, you can say that explicitly, and even just reinforcing that, I think, especially with ignorant civilian audiences, is very helpful, because it makes them think about the difference between you and your professional capacity, which is nonpartisan, and you and your personal capacity, which can be as partisan as you want.
But we would love for even in your personal that you not broadcast that too much, because we'll make the association with the military. So yeah, you can express those things in a personal family setting, but the general sentiment is, even if it's personal, let's keep it fairly contained. I'll just use that.
Care to chime in, Dr. Ender, or go to the next one?
I mean, well, this might get a little bit too social psychological, but again, I'm a sociologist and I study things at kind of the micro level. You know, there's a difference between the older generations, especially the baby boomers, and younger generations that really are insisting on this ability to kind of compartmentalize their identities. That, you know, they're, you know, I think Generation Z and millennials are really telling us that, you know, I can be all these different things to all these different people. You know, I don't need to be an officer 24/7, for example. And I think a number of senior leaders have a tough time with that. So I don't know if there's a way to begin to kind of, you know, tap into that with sort of, you know, rules and regulations about how you compartmentalize that in terms of, you know, playing out your politics or your leisure activities or your military roles and those kinds of things. But I think the next generation of mid-level officers and senior officers are going to begin to insist that we be able to do that.
So another, a final question, I would say, or actually, I'll just give you each the floor for about 2 minutes just to give you closing remarks. So we're respective of everybody's time. So we'll start with Dr. Ender for your closing remarks.
Well, again, Dan, really appreciate being invited to speak. I see a whole, I'm busy reading, you know, the questions here. I'm looking forward to kind of engaging some of these questions offline. I invite anybody who would like to, contact me and discuss these things offline. I'm certainly available. Looking forward to people kind of continuing to work in this area. I think we are in some ways a major transition period. In some ways, much like the move to the all-volunteer force, I think we're in a period here where race and LGBTQ and sex and gender and religious accommodation and all of these things are going to manifest more deeply. In some ways, the United States has been involved in this ongoing citizenship revolutions where people are looking for first-class citizenship status in the United States. They want to be first-class citizens. They want to take advantage of all the opportunities that exist in the United States. And one space that plays out is within the military. I think the most lethal force in the history of humanity can certainly accommodate those folks. And indeed, on a practical level, it opens up entire pools of people to be the best possible service members they can be. I mean, when we opened up opportunities for women in every MOS right now, we've basically opened up 51% of the population, an entire pool of people. So I look forward to continuing to study that. I appreciate the opportunity. As always, go Army, beat Navy.
Thanks, Dr. Ender. I think I remember one of the last few conversations at the Academy, you talked about, this next revolution of disabled folks and ableism, and where is there an opportunity for people to serve? And we see with the cyber capacities, maybe that is kind of the next opportunity for a population of folks who can add to the fight. General Stewart?
The other reason I wrote the op-ed that I did was having seen events like this and having experienced bigotry and racism and hate. The hardest part about writing that piece was the fact that I could not protect my children from that kind of behavior, and my great concern that I could not protect my grandchildren from that kind of behavior. So it became very important for me to write something that would allow us to take this moment and truly turn it into a movement that changes the way we interact with each other in our society and does something, add our voice and add our effort to making this a more perfect union. I ask everybody to take a look at John Lewis's op-ed in the New York Times today. I ask everybody to just make sure that we don't just talk about this for the next couple, 3 months and then take no action. This is a great opportunity for us to do something, do our part in making this a more perfect union and live out the true meaning of our Constitution. So that's my challenge to everyone.
Thanks, General Stewart. I think it's important that we think about what is in that Constitution, as our military is not beholden to a particular party, but swears an oath to that sworn document. Dr. Friend?
Yeah, Dan, I just want to thank you for having this event in the first place. I feel really honored and humbled to be in this company with General Stewart and Dr. Ender and Dr. Biddle. I guess my particular focus in civil relations is on the civilian side, which is a little understudied. And I just want to sort of double down on my answer to your earlier question, which is that civilians in this relationship, civilians in civil society, civilians at the elite level who are working in government, who are themselves representatives and politicians, they need to take both of these issues seriously. They need to take grappling with racism and becoming anti-racist seriously, and to actually take actions personally and persistently. And by they, I mean we. And we also have a special responsibility for keeping the military nonpartisan. And that's an uphill struggle right now, but it is something that we cannot just leave to the military. We cannot consistently put the military in a position where they are asked to make partisan choices or try to avoid making partisan signals with their every move. And I just see no way out of that conundrum unless civilians and particularly politicians stop putting the military in that position. And part of that is deciding what is and is not partisan. And, you know, it is perhaps naive of me, but it is my firm hope that opposing racism is not a partisan issue. And so that when we hear active and retired 4-stars, former general and flag officers make statements about opposition to racism, that there's nothing partisan about that. And I will also shamelessly plug, if the audience likes civ-mil relations, please tune in to Thank You for Your Service podcast. My co-host Jim Golby and I are trying to take up these and many, many other issues as well. But again, thank you, Dan, for pulling this together.
Thank you, Dr. Friend, for your remarks and participation. And the podcast is great and really does attempt to answer a lot of tough questions that we talked about today. And I just would like to reiterate my thanks for all of the panelists for coming, for Professor Biddle with the introduction, and for SEPA for hosting this event. So thank you everyone for coming. And if you're unable to connect here, I'm sure you can find us all on Twitter and re-engage there as we do nowadays moving forward. Thank you, everyone.